and she is going to be coordinating a renewed effort to recruit more volunteers. So if you're interested in working here in any way, shape, or form, let us know.
Gosh, along those same lines, if you're interested in working at the Wallowa History Center,
There you go.
I got a deal
There
for
you
you.
go.
So
And if you don't drive and you live in Enterprise, you can volunteer at Fish Trap.
that's right.
If you don't drive and live in Wallow, you can work at the History Center.
That's right.
And if you don't drive and you live here, you can work here, okay?
No shortage of opportunities.
No shortage of. Well, listen, this is a great pleasure, and to have Jennifer here. Just a little introduction. I used to get to go into her classroom in Wallowa years and years ago. I don't even remember. I was at Fish Trap. I'd bring writers in there. We'd do everything. And Jennifer just was a hell of a teacher.
Oh, well, thank you.
And right now she is supervising or mentoring, excuse me.
Oh, no, I'm supervising.
Supervising. I should have known that.
University supervisor.
Teachers for Eastern Oregon University, who are
Student teachers.
Yep.
teachers.
Yes.
What do you call them?
Yep.
Student teachers.
Yeah.
Student teachers.
Yep.
So Mike and Fish Trap got this ball rolling with Cold Millions. How many of you have read the Cold Millions? Okay. Well, I read it. It's pretty interesting, but it chased me back to In Dubious Valor by Steinbeck, which is a story about the unions in the apple orchards in California a little later in the 30s. And I thought Steinbeck had written about Centralia. It turns out he had not. But I made a bike trip when I was in college, and I rode from Seattle up to Canada and back through, and I went through Centralia. And I saw the statue of the 4 Legionnaires.
Oh, yes.
Okay?
Yes.
So I'd always been kind of puzzled by that story.
Okay, I'll do my best. It's a
So-
convoluted situation.
When Jennifer finds the sheet music for the Wallowa Love Song at the Wallowa History Center, and then traces the granddaughter of one of the victims, I should say, the wrongly jailed people from the Centralia massacre, traced it to a book. So she told me about it, and I got the book. And we just agreed that it's 400 and I don't know, 40 pages or something.
It's a little
And it has everything in it, and some good writer could take it and make a 250-page bestseller out of it.
Oh,
Or Jennifer said, make a movie out of it.
totally.
Because this guy, Eugene Barnet, is incredible. And I just, one more thing that I'll get on my political high horse now. This guy starts in the coal mines when he's 7 years
Oh,
old.
you're doing my whole presentation, buddy.
I just want people to know that, doggone it, we lose track of how awful things were
That's right.
for labor
That's right.
in the United States, and how exploited labor was in this country.
No.
And I, just went and got a union card. Anyway, Jennifer Gibbs.
All right.
Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I'll try really hard not to be political and just tell a story. We'll see how this goes. But yes, I'm Jennifer Gibbs, and I'm on the board at the Wallowa History Center. And this whole crazy story started because I was doing some research. We had the 7th graders came in, and they were going to do presentations to their class on Wallowa County. And so they wanted to come to the History Center and get some information, and so I was doing some things to get ready, and I was digging through some files in the Mary Ann Burroughs Research Library, which is in the basement of the History Center. And could you move? Can I help you? Thanks. Sorry. I'm not very good at following directions.
You're wonderful.
Okay, all right.
It's just everybody wants to see
Oh, yeah, sorry.
you. And you're not blocking.
No, okay.
Can everybody see
I
her?
know. Okay.
Put her up even more now that I've interrupted.
Well, this is getting me thinking about me and Sally, about a whole different thing, about how to have an interpretive space and also have it be a functional presentation space. But anyway, that's again another story. Okay, so I'm in the History Center and I'm doing some digging, and we have all these files that Mary Ann started years ago, and I'm looking for Wallowa Lake, and I see this file, and it's called Wallowa Love, and I'm like, what the heck is this? So I pull it out, and it's this amazing sheet music with this cover. And I mean, right away, aren't you just drawn into this cover? It's amazing. And so I'm like, what is this? And it gets even better because the first page in this, the first sheet is a historical note. And it references a book called Recent Indian Wars. It was published in 1891, coincidentally the same year that Eugene Barnet was born. And it's by James P. Boyd. And I just asked Rich, hey, do you have this book? And he's like, no, well, we don't have it at the History Center either, but what'd you say it was worth $400? You just looked it up?
First edition is $4.99.
Yeah, so if anybody runs across Recent Indian Wars, I'm interested. So he quotes this book, and he said, in the book it says that the lower Nez Perces were bounded on one side by the Snake River and on the other by the Blue Mountains, between the mountains and valleys in such rapid succession as to make the country undesirable for whites, yet lovable to the Indians. And Eugene says, Mr. Boyd evidently never lived in Wallowa. And he goes on to say, today, Wallowa's grassy hills are the grounds for, cattle and sheep, and streams are full of trout. The hills and canyons are alive with game, and gold is still panned from the gravel of the streams. But could all the gold in the world, with the charmed land of Wallowa included, repay our race for what was lost when we broke the faith of the Honorable Chief Joseph? In the integrity of a promise, that this song will give you pleasure, and that our love for truth and justice will grow as strong in the future as our love of gold has been in the past, is the sincere wish of Eugene Barnet. I thought, well, that's so interesting, the love of truth and justice. This whole thing is a love story. It's a love story about the love for truth and justice, the love for the Wallowa Valley, and the love for his wife. Well, right around this time is when Gary Eller was going around. He was doing a project of the songs of the Hells Canyon, Slim, and he had been to Wallowa. So I sent him an email and said, hey, I just found this really awesome music. And he said, well, what do you know about this guy? And I'm like, I don't know anything about him. Let's see what I can find out. So I started doing some digging, and boy, it was super interesting. And one thing led to another, and I learned all kinds of things. So one of the first things I found was, it was a publication from the Washington State Historical Society, and it was a transcript of a recording from 1940. It's called Eugene Barnet Talks About the Centralia Conspiracy, Oral History from an IWW Participant in the Events of November 11th, 1919 in Centralia, Washington. And if you go online and find that, there's also audio available, so you can listen to him in his own words. This is probably the first time there was a recording of a first-hand account of a labor dispute, of a labor issue. So that's kind of interesting. They called it a vocumentary because it was a vocal documentary, and I'd never heard that term before. In fact, I had never heard of a wobbly before. I had never heard of the IWW before. And I'm old, and I taught for 34 years, right? It's like I keep. Probably every other day I think about a book Rich gave me called Lies My Teacher Told Me, and it's like, oh my gosh, sorry kids. Anyway, I kept trying to be like, World War I, what? IWW? So anyway, that was all new to me. In that document, one of the guys who worked on it quoted Eugene Barnet as a man of many facets. Among other things, he was a miner, a lumber worker, construction worker, craft worker, taxidermist, fox farmer, dictionary salesman, songwriter, poet, artist, storyteller, homesteader. Oh my goodness, he did it all. Road builder, and also a member of the IWW, and between 1920 and 1931, a class war prisoner in Washington State Penitentiary at Walla Walla. And so that's where I started. I did some more digging. And I found this article from the Lewiston Tribune about, it was like in like the Go magazine type, you know, what we would have. And it was an article about a book that a gal had written. Her name is Esther Barnett Goffinet, and she wrote this book about her father. And she said that her children needed to know about their grandfather. And she'd go to the libraries or she'd look up old newspaper articles, and she said the things she was reading were lies about her dad. And she wanted her kids to know the real truth and the real Eugene Barnet. And so she wrote this book, Ripples of a Lie. And I'm thinking, gosh, is she still alive? She still live in Lewiston? So I do some research. I find her email. I sent her an email. It was like about a half an hour. I get a phone call, and it's Esther. And she just turned 80. She's amazing, amazing. We've talked several times since then. She says, you know, I'm not a writer, I'm a nurse. And I said, well, that's okay. I'm not really a historian, I'm a teacher. So we get along great. That's where this all starts. 2 weeks later, I'm in Enterprise, and I'm at the book loft, and I see this stack of books, Kids on Strike. And I asked Becky, what's this about? And she's like, oh, it's the big read. It's about Wobblies. And I'm like, what? It's about Wobblies? Well, I just got this book, and it's about Wobblies. This is so crazy. So now I've read both of the books, The Cold Millions and Ripples of a Lie, and there are so many things that coincide. The people, the places, the songs, all of it. So that's pretty fascinating. Well, in this story about Eugene Barnet, as Rich was saying, it goes clear back to when he was a kid. He's 7 years old, and they lived in North Carolina. And a man, I would call him a recruiter, that was originally from the area, came and spoke to a lot of people and said, we have great jobs for you. You can provide for your families. This is a golden opportunity. You all should move with us to West Virginia and work in the coal mines. And so Eugene's dad and 3 of his uncles actually load up their families, and off they go. And they go to West Virginia to mine. And Eugene sees some people along the river in tents and a bunch of kids, and they don't look very happy. And he's like, what's that about? And his dad's like, oh, well, those are the men that refuse to work. You don't want anything to do with them. That's why we're coming, because they want men that will work. So that was his first ever experience with, what's wrong with this picture? They get to their new town at the coal mine, company town, and they're given a pretty decent house. That's pretty exciting. Oh, it's going to cost you, but don't worry, because we're going to take it out of your first check. It'll be fine. You can shop at this amazing store. You can get anything you ever wanted to. And by the way, you can only shop at this store. You don't go to a neighboring town and shop, or you'll be fired. And don't worry, you don't have any money? No problem. We're going to take care of you. It'll just come out of your check. You can even we're going to even provide medical care for you. We have a doctor here, $1 a month. Okay, great. Well, not so great, because day one, the first time ever, Eugene's father's in debt. Oh, and by the way, as long as you owe the company money, you can't leave the company. I don't know what would happen, but those were the rules, right? All right, so Eugene's mom's super disappointed. One reason she wanted to come was because she knew there would be schools there for the kids. Well, her kids weren't allowed to go to the school. The schools were for, the owner's kids, supervisor's kids, but certainly not the miners' kids.
What year was this?
Oh, good question. This was in, let's see, 7. I'm going to have to do some work here. He was born in 18.
91, so it would have been 1898.
Yes. There you go. Okay, tell me that again.
1898, if he was.
It was 1898. Okay, that's why you're here, Sally, I like it. All right, so 1898, because he's, well, so by now he's, yeah, if he's 7, totally. By the way, I stole that last slide and this slide from PBS, just because I thought they were interesting and illustrated what we're talking about. But in the mines, Eugene's dad found out if he signed a piece of paper that said Eugene was 16, then Eugene could work. So, of course he did, because they need as much money as they possibly can get. And so Eugene goes to work, he's 7 years old. Now, picture this. As a grown man, Eugene's only 5'6". So you can imagine what he looked like when he was 7, right? And they had to jimmy rig the helmet, you know, the hard hat to fit his little head. And little kids, one of their first jobs would be picking rocks off the tracks, keeping the track clean. Eugene was smart, he paid attention, he listened, so he got a pretty good job pretty early. And it was flagging mule drivers so that they wouldn't have collisions, and also keeping the doors, opening and closing doors to allow the right amount of air to come in, wind, keep bad air out, good air in. Flagging mules was super important because if you had a mule collision, you had a terrible problem. Mules were really valuable. Man gets hurt or killed, super easy to replace. You got a new guy in there by the end of the day. Your mule gets killed, it takes some time and it takes some money. So he had a really important job. I don't know if this is, I don't know. Come on, Esther. I think her dad may have stretched the truth on times. He was a character. But the story is, the first day on the job, he's in the mine and he's doing his thing. And it gets really quiet. And he's thinking, where is everybody? And how long do I have before the oil in my lamp goes out? And so he decides, I better get out of here. And he had ridden in, and so was not positive he knew the way out, but he figured he could find his way out. Before he gets out, his lamp does go out, and he's down on his hands and knees crawling along the trail, on the track, and he makes it out. Oh, they quit early that day. They just forgot to tell him. They completely forgot he was down there. Another time, anyway, I don't know. Things are going, that's how things are going. A thing he really liked about the camps is somebody had dogs, had hounds, and he could go hunting on his spare time. He could run with the dogs. He really loved that part of things. The family goes to a different mine in West Virginia. I'm unsure if it was owned by the same company or not, but they were happy about this one because this mine had a fan, so the air was better. And it talks in the books about how, you could hear guys throwing up, coughing, gagging all day long because of the air they were breathing. But this one had better air, it had a fan. So they go to this new mine, and Gene's again given a job. He's a trapper of 2 doors, he tends 7 switches. He gets bigger, and when he's bigger, he can carry couplings, he can help brake cars. So that's what he's doing, and in this new mine, the tracks are wooden, hence more accidents. And definitely one of the trips did jump the tracks, ran him over. He broke ankle, broke his foot, his ankle, dislocated his knee. So he was out of commission for a while for sure. The company, good thing they got a company doctor, right? He came, looked at him, said, oh, it'll heal, gave him some pain medicine, and that was that. And it did heal, but of course it was not straight, problematic for the rest of his life. All right, Gene's dad feels really bad about this, right? His poor little kid's all banged up, mine's closed down for repairs. So he takes Gene to a nearby town, and they go to a Wild West show. Oh my gosh, Gene is in love. He can't believe it. It's amazing. And he's like, I have to remember every detail, so when I get home, I can tell my brothers and sisters about how awesome this is. And he falls in love with the West, and he falls in love with Annie Oakley, and he's like, oh my gosh, I wish I was older. I would marry her. She's amazing. So that was his standard for women the rest of his life. And His sisters used to tease him, oh, he won't go out with you. If you're not Annie Oakley, forget it. Well, Gene's mom's unhappy. She hates this particular camp that they're at because it's so full of wickedness. His mom she's very religious. She can't stand it. People are living together that aren't even married, for example, and they're drinking, all kinds of terrible things are happening, which I'm sure happened at every camp they were in. But she complains, and they move on to a new mine in Pennsylvania. Now, Gene's 11 by now, and he's listening to a lot of talks. In fact, some of the people that show up in the Cold Million show up there, like Mother Jones, for example. So he's listening to lectures. He's listening to some of the men talk. He thinks this union thing sounds like a good idea, and he's trying to talk to his dad about it, which I'm sure his dad really appreciated, because you know how 11-year-olds are, and they know everything. And he's like, you know what, it's a bunch of poppycock, stay away from that, we don't need that. They go to Pennsylvania, and they go to work, and surprisingly enough, this time it's, he's big enough he can work with his dad, actually. Instead of doing like the tripping and running the switches, he's working side by side with his dad shoveling coal. His dad's getting almost the pay of 2 grown men. So this is really great. But then, surprisingly, it's his dad that gets hurt. Gene has to pack him out. And Gene's not big enough to shovel coal by himself, so then he does go back to his old jobs. One day he's at work, and he hears a kaboom, and the door gets knocked off and falls on him, breaks his arm. Fortunately, the door falls on him, because then there's a second explosion. It probably saved his life, quite possibly. And he comes to, he gets the door off of him. He's got a broken arm. I don't know how bigger than life, this character. He knows if he does not cover up that door, that they will all die for sure, because the air only will last for so long. So he finds a tarp, and as best he can, covers up the doorway, and then he hightails it out of there as best he can. There's only one way in. I mean, it leads a lot of places, but ultimately there's only one way to get into this mine, and there's only one way to get out. And those are some of those, terrible working conditions that the union was fighting against. So he does manage to find the opening. He's climbing the stairs. Several guys are behind him and encouraging him to keep going. And then the stairs catch on fire. I know, if I get through this thing without crying, it's gonna be a miracle. The stairs catch on fire. These men all fall to their fiery deaths, the pits of hell. And he gets out, and he feels so bad. He thinks, those guys could have passed me up easily, but they didn't. And he had terrible night terrors from then on. He had a brother who, at one of the mine camps, got really sick and had terrible fevers, was never quite right after that, was kind of a forever child. Gene went to sleeping with him. He didn't even care if he peed the bed every night, because he wanted company of having somebody with him at night. That was Sherman. When I talked to my granddaughters about this story, that was their takeaway. Whatever happened to Sherman, and who took care of him when their mom got old? Anyway, so he survives. Now, they can't stay there, because Dad, remember, got hurt, and now he's been hurt. So the company says, you guys have to leave. The widows of all those poor men who were killed, you have to leave. We got to make room for more workers to move in here. So they leave again. Now they go to New Jersey, and they decide, forget this mining business, and they get a little truck farm. It's like, 3/4 of an acre, and they live there. Dad builds a house there. They have managed to buy it, and things are going along pretty good. Gene gets a job at a tailor shop, and, he likes it fine. I think Gene was, the grass is, what do you call it? He liked adventure. So he would easily tire of something. He was always wanting to see new things, so it was okay. He got paid okay, not near as much as he got paid in the mine. So he went to some other factory jobs. He worked at a knife factory, and he was working on making handles of knives. And 1 week he got his paycheck, he got an envelope, and it had an extra $1 in it. And so he immediately went to the owner and said, there's a mistake, you paid me too much money. And the boss was so impressed with his honesty, it's kind of the George Washington cherry tree story, so impressed with his honesty that he, from then on, continued to make an extra $1 a week. As long as he stayed. I don't know how long he did. His sisters, by the way, went to work at a sweatshop. One of his sisters starts taking a lot of interest in women's rights and doing really scandalous things like wearing her skirt just above her ankle and attending some marches and things. All right, Dad gets better, so guess what he does? And by the way, you guys can stop me anytime, ask questions, whatever. Dad goes back to the mines. So Dad's well enough, they need the money, that's where the money is, so he goes back to work in the mines. All right, now, Gene's 13, right? He's a grown man, he's 13 years old. And so, this is again a picture I found on the internet, but I thought it illustrated the point well. Both these books mention boxing too, which is also interesting. Anyway, he decides, you know what, he's going to go to Pennsylvania too. That's where his dad is. He might as well go to Pennsylvania. So he hops the train, and he has a little adventure, and he ends up getting to Pennsylvania, and pretty soon he doesn't have a penny, and he's, I don't know, it's a few days, and he's tired and wet, and he ends up in a Bible mission, and they feed him and tell him that if he'll work, he can stay there as long as he works for him and helps get people wood and things. And he gets up in the morning, and there's a policeman, and he gets arrested. And he's like, well, what are the charges? And the policeman says, well, you're a runaway. His mom had worried about him, and she had reported him. And he's like, well, send me to my dad. And there's some problem with the telegraph poles are down or something from a storm. Anyway, his dad, by the time his dad hears about it, it's all said and done. They send him back to his mom. So he goes back to his mom. He goes back to work for the tailor, and he does that for a while. But not long, because as soon as it's springtime, he's off again. I don't imagine he asked permission or anything else, and he took off, and this time he went to Ohio. So he's 14 years old, and he does mine in Ohio, but he only mines at a union mine. And he's very proud of it. He joins his first union when he's 14, and he happily pays his dues. So, things are going pretty great until he gets typhoid, super sick, so he ends up back at home for a while, and he stays till he's 17. He decides he wants to join the Navy, but he can't because he's so crippled up that they don't take him. So, and he all the time is thinking about how he would really like to go to the West. Someday he's going to go to the West, but he rides the rails. He goes to Illinois. He works building roads. His parents also end up in Illinois, and his dad goes to work in a steel mine. And guess what happens? There's yet another terrible accident. I don't know how they lived through this. He either died or got really beat up. A steel mine fell on his dad, broke his back. Mom sends a telegram to Eugene, you have to come home. Dad's hurt bad. So he goes home, helps out there for a while till he's 19. Well, this time he really does go west. So he heads out. He first gets a job at a cattle ranch in Wyoming. He sees real cowboys and real Indians. It is awesome. He writes his siblings about it. He goes to Denver. One day one of his jobs, he did drive a mule for 3 days at a mine, but then he found out that the guys working were scabs, and so he said, forget this, quit them. And ironically, the next couple of days, there was a huge explosion there that killed all the guys that were working. He's still in Colorado. He gets a job working as a grader, building irrigation systems and dams. He heads to Washington. When he was a kid, somewhere along the line, he had seen a brochure about Washington State. And he was like, boy, that looked like a beautiful place. So that's where he's going. He's going to Washington. Now, along the way, he stops in Utah. He picks peaches. He stops in the Dalles in Oregon. He works at an ice company. I don't know. Would that be the Dalles, Oregon? Anyway. town to town job, job to job, living the hobo life, loving the hobo life, because it's big fun, you know. You see all kinds of places, you meet all kinds of people. You know, he was a teenager, have all kinds of good parties, you talk big ideas, you know. So he was enjoying this. He ends up in Washington, and he stays with a couple. Their names are James and Marie McAllister in Chehalis, Washington, and he really likes them because they're also Southerners. Phew, finally somebody knows how to cook, right? And they become pretty good friends. At this point, he starts logging, and he found the logging conditions to be terrible. The guys all have to sleep in one small bunkhouse. They don't get a chance to ever wash their clothes. If they do and hang them up at night, you know, he said it was like a spider web going out from the stove, where they'd all hang their wet clothes. They'd steam all night by the fire. There's hardly any ventilation. Wasn't good. Food wasn't good. Toiletry needs weren't good, you know. So he's talking to these guys union ideas for sure. And this is, at this point in time, he buys a IWW songbook because he really liked the preamble. He really liked the things that he was reading that it stood for. All right, so it's 1912. He's kind of growing up. He's getting tired of living this wild life. And it, you know, it talks about how he would get the, oh good grief, what did he call it? The crumbs. When you get the crumbs, things are bad, and that's when you got to boil your clothes, and because you got such terrible body lice. Anyway, it doesn't sound fun to me. But he decides he's going to settle down. He goes to Whitebird, Idaho. Day one, he meets the stockman, and he gets a job cowboying. All right, this is good. This is what he likes. And the stockman says, you know, hey, I got an idea. You can apply to get a homestead in the Joseph Plains, which is above the Salmon River, and, you know, prove it up, and you'll have a place to live. You'll have your very own place. And really, the rancher's thinking, and it connects to my place, so when you don't prove it up, because you're a wild kid, I'll get it. Well, Gene takes that challenge, and he immediately goes to work on this place. Now, a road goes 2 miles to the homestead. You got to pack in the rest of the way. And, I mean, you know the country, right? We all know the Snake River country. It's steep and rocky. He somehow manages to get wire up there, builds fence, starts a little garden, is thinking about building a house. And while he's doing all this, you know, he needs money, right? You gotta have money to build a house and build fence and all these things, get good stock. He goes to work as driving a bundle wagon, right, for a harvest crew. So I don't know if at some point he gets a favorite horse that like only he can ride, right? People want him to train their horses. The horses will only listen to Gene. He's such a great cowboy. So he's working on this harvest. And imagine it's in Cottonwood, which is like 35 miles away. And he meets this beautiful cook. She's cooking for the crew. Oh my gosh, she's gorgeous. And not only is she good looking, she can ride, she can shoot, she can rope. Oh, he's finally met Annie Oakley. Oh my gosh. Well, her name is Effie. Oh, by the way, right through this country is the Nez Perce Trail. So right on his homestead, they go by his house all the time. And they're going from the reservation to Wallowa, to the Wallowa Valley and back and forth. And he befriends them. They teach him how to tan hides. He learns how to spearfish. He thinks it's great. So, Annie Oakley, he writes to his parents and he says, you guys should move here. And, you know, we'll build a house for you two, bring everybody. Idaho's amazing, you're gonna love it. And he starts to build his house. In fact, pretty much, it's almost done by the time of 1915. And by now his parents have moved there, and he goes to Cottonwood, and her parents are there, his parents are there, and they get married. and it's awesome, right? For their honeymoon, you wanna know what they did for their honeymoon? They took a pack trip, and they rode from their homestead, which wasn't quite done, by the way. We probably exaggerated a little bit to Effie. She didn't even care. There wasn't a door yet. Oh, no problem. As long as she could get a cook stove, and how they got a cook stove up there is beyond me. But they did, and she was happy. And she had a nice, comfortable bed, so it was all good. Well, they took this pack trip, took a couple of weeks, and they rode from their homestead to Wallowa Lake. And they had the best time. It was the favorite time of their lives, right? And nothing could be better. It was amazing. Things go pretty good. They survive the winter. Gene does a lot of hunting and trapping. By this time, they've got some cattle. They've got some good horses. Gene's applying for a neighboring homestead, at least one. He has big plans. They have a little horse incident. And one of, maybe even two of their horses run off. And when they go to find them, Effie's horse has had a terrible fall, didn't make it, but her saddle was there. She went back the next day, I don't think Eugene knew this, to get her saddle and bring it home, and she ends up having a miscarriage. So that's another terrible, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't know, don't read this book. It can't get any worse. You turn the page, it gets worse. Anyway, so she loses their first child, a baby girl. The next winter, Gene says, forget this, we're gonna go live in Cottonwood during the winter time. And so he's got some time. He does a lot of reading, and he's certainly interested in reading about the IWW. He's reading about it a lot, and he's talking about it a lot, because he's liking some of these big ideas. And then surprisingly, for the first time in his life, he starts having some trouble getting work because people are not liking what he's having to say. Well, it didn't stop him completely from getting work, because he and his dad go to work building road. And they, this is Lewiston grade, which they helped build, but before that they built the Whitebird grade. It's in 1917. And Gene asked for a raise, and they refused it. So he got all the guys to come together. He wrote up a paper. He had everybody sign it. It's like, if we all work together, we can make this happen. And the road guys had a deal with the ranchers. They couldn't pay more than what the ranchers were paying, but they did come to an agreement, and they did end up with $3 a day for a 16-hour day, and that was pretty great. So that was one of his first experiences as a labor organizer. Well, by now World War II has started, and Eugene thinks, you know what, that's great if people want to go fight in a war. They have every right to. In fact, he had tried to do it. But nobody should have to do it. Nobody should be forced to go to war, and in fact, it's unconstitutional, and he could recite the Constitution, and he's spouting out about this at the post office and at the cafe, and the next day, surprise, surprise, who should show up at his door but a policeman, and he gets arrested for high treason. The people, he had said some things in front of people that didn't appreciate what he had to say, and reported him. There was a write-up in the Lewiston paper. I should have tried to find it, but I haven't. But it said he was a dangerous character who would blow up flour mills and railroads. And it mentioned how the government had given him a fine homestead, and yet he was a traitor. And he said later, well, yeah, you know, that homestead was so fine even a goat wasn't safe, but because it was so steep. Anyway, he spends 18 days in jail. He goes to Moscow to go to court. He ends up getting thrown out. But the judge did say, hey, you need to stay away from the IWW, the I won't work, and get it together. So now, Gene not only has a reputation, he's got a record. All right, so World War I. The government's asking anybody who's ever worked in a mine, please return to the mines, because they need America needs all the coal that we can get to make all the steel. And so Gene decides, all right, let's go to Washington and I'm gonna go back to work in the mines. So he and Effie load up this big wagon and take some of their horses and load up baby Eugene, and off they go. Now, ironically, they go right after the harvest, and that was in 1919, and that was in November 11th when the war ended, and it was Armistice Day. So they go to mine, but the desire for coal slows down immediately. So there's not a lot of mining happening. He does mine, but he's only working a couple of days a week, and the rest of the time he's working on a road crew. In fact, he worked that road crew for 6 months. He asked for a raise, he got fired. This is the mine they worked at. I don't know how to say this. Some of you might know. Copia, maybe? Copia, Washington. It's no longer a town, but that's where they were, and that's Eugene on the right, and that's his son Cliff in the foreground. And this is the mine that they worked at. For a while, they leased a little farm, and he tried really hard to mine and work at odd jobs and farm, and it didn't quite pan out, needless to say. They ended up moving to the company town, the company camp, and lived in one of the company's houses. And this is when he joins the IWW. And actually, that was when they first show up here. That was in April of 1918. That doesn't quite work, does it? Anyway, Sally's going to catch me on my math. Round in there sometime, he had joined the IWW. So they're living here in Copia, and this is when he befriends a guy named Elmer Smith, who's a lawyer for the IWW, and in fact worked oh my goodness, somebody can help me out with this. Not Centralia, but had worked that incident that was in our book, right? Was it? Did that show up in this book or maybe not? No, it was later. But anyway, well-known IWW lawyer. Gene is, he's the secretary for his local union here at this mine, and he's a socialist, and he's a member of the IWW. He didn't attend too many meetings, and in fact, Effie was super uncomfortable with it, and he promised her, oh yeah, I'll get out of it, which I don't know if I believe him, but that's what he said. Don't worry, Effie, I'm not going to do anything stupid. Everything's going to be fine. So he did make a big point, or at least Esther makes a big point in her book, to always remind everybody he was never a communist. He was a socialist, but not a communist. All right, so because the mine wasn't working, there was a national coal strike that happened in 1919. Great, he had a lot of time on his hands. He was happy because what did he want to do? He wanted to run his dogs, hunt. Here's a picture of him and his friend Bert Bland, and here's his son Cliff. These photos were taken on November 10th, 1919, according to his daughter. The next day is November 11th, and he decides he's going to go into town. He's got some important papers that he had got about his homestead. They still have that homestead in Idaho, and he's leased it to some other guys that are running it for him, and he still has to prove it up. He still has to prove that he's doing things with the land in order to actually get the deed. So he's got to go to town. He's got to get this paper notarized. Effie was too busy to go. Interesting. One account, I think it's in this book, she's busy making a dress for her sister. In another paper I read, some other research I read, it might have been even his own words, she didn't have clothes ready for Cliff. Regardless, and I'm sure he doesn't know because she was doing something that women do, she couldn't go. That's the bottom line. She's doing something sewing or who knows what. So she doesn't go. But he says he'll mail this package for her, and she's sending some geranium slips for her mom, and yep, he'll do that. So he goes to town, And he is surprised to find it's a holiday. It's the first anniversary of Armistice Day. And there's a parade happening. The post office is closed. I just don't tell Esther. Oh, Esther, if you watch this, I don't know. Esther, do you wonder, interesting that he's with Bert. Now they have to be talking about some of this stuff. Because the next day, things go very badly when he goes to Centralia. The other thing is, though, that is totally possible, they don't have cell phones. They don't know exactly when things are happening. It's not like anybody knows when anybody else is. They don't even have phones at all, right? So it's truly possible that he was completely oblivious to all the things that were going to go down the next day. He goes to town, and he finds the post office is closed. He goes to see his friend and lawyer. He wants to get his land papers taken care of. The lawyer's not in the office right then, so he goes to kill some time. Now, this is the Roderick Hotel, and it happens to be owned by the McAllisters, those same folks that he stayed with early on. And they're now running this Roderick Hotel. The Union, the Wobbly, the IWW Union Hall is, I believe, to the right side as we look at this picture. Now, these old buildings are just like all of like the buildings here in Joseph or in Wallowa and Enterprise. You know, a big building could house many different businesses, and you couldn't get to one from the other without going in the front door or the back door. So it's a whole separate situation. It just coincidentally happens to be the same building. So Eugene does go to the Union Hall. Now, wait a minute. Didn't he tell Effie he was going to get out of this? Well, he probably would eventually, but he did go to the Union Hall. And why did he do this? Because he wanted to read the papers and he wants to know what's going on with the coal strike. That makes pretty good sense. And then he decides he's hungry. He goes over next door to visit with the McAllisters to have some lunch. And the parade starts up. They're watching the parade from the window, from the front window. He notices a couple of trucks pull up in front of the hall, some armored trucks. Now, this isn't new. This has been happening all over the Northwest, right? He thinks they're going to load some guys up in those trucks. He sees some of the Legionnaires and some other people, as they're coming down the street, stop and form a formation in front of the hall. He's like, oh man, there's going to be trouble. Now, he's not ever shied away from trouble, obviously. You can just kind of picture this little character, right? I have a feeling he's probably a little bit mouthy and very confident. And he takes his coat off, and he's going to go get in this fisticuff. He's going to stand by his brothers. And he starts out the door, and he hears a gunshot. He hightails it back in. Forget it. I'm not getting in the middle of this. So, there is definitely a fight. When he was in there earlier, there were 5 or 6 guys in there, but he didn't notice any weapons. He didn't notice anything unusual. He didn't know any of them except for Britt Smith, and Britt was the organizer of the union, who also happened to live there, not any relation to Elmer Smith. All right, so things are going way bad. The Legionnaires come into the hotel, and they're going to go through to the back and try to get these guys that have gone through the back. Oh my goodness. And they're vandalizing. One guy's got a hatchet. They're breaking stuff up. Eugene says, hey, you know, Mrs. McAllister doesn't deserve this. She's like trying to say, do you see the American flag here? Do you see, you know, we support the Red Cross. We don't want any trouble. They're not having any of it. Mr. McAllister tells Eugene, keep your mouth shut, go home. You're going to end up in jail. So he's like, okay, I guess that's what I'll do. And he heads for home. Now, as he's headed home, he realizes he forgot his coat. And in his coat pocket are his important papers. Also happened to be his union card. So he thinks, you know what? I think I'd better go back and get my coat. So he goes back. So he's there long enough to see total pandemonium. Everybody's grabbing guns. Everybody's running around, even little boys. People are going on wobbly hunts. He sees a man at a telephone pole with a mob around him. They've got, you know, a rope around his neck. We now know that was Wesley Everest. He goes in, he gets his coat, puts his union card in his sock, and he leaves again. A car pulls up, he thinks maybe he can get a ride, but the conversation is obviously not in the favor he wants it to be. So no, that doesn't make sense. I just made that up about the ride because he's got his horse. Anyway, he had an uncomfortable conversation. How's that? He rides his horse back home. He's kind of thinking, you know, I could get my gun. I could go back. I could find somebody with the car. Effie says, no way. You are staying here. Stay out of this. He agrees. He's had time to calm down. But they have records of course, every member. Furniture was being taken out of that hall, papers were being taken out, fires were being started. Anyway, it doesn't take long before here comes a mob of guys to get him. And so at first he runs out to the woods behind the house. They're totally tearing his house apart, breaking things up. He surrenders. And they arrest him. Now he tells Effie as he's leaving, he's like, well, hi there. He tells Effie as he's leaving, you know, don't worry, I'll see you in a couple of days. Everything's going to be okay. Well, it was 12 years before they were reunited. I'm telling you, if I get through this without crying. So, shocking situation for everybody involved. I mean, even though all through the nation this is happening, right? Wobblies are being targeted, arrested, prosecuted. It might have been the first time ever that they were prepared and they knew the attack was coming, so they were armed. So that wasn't what anybody was expecting. They were expecting some fighting, some guys to get beat up, some guys to get run out of town. Nobody was expecting this. Elmer Smith, the lawyer, had actually advised them that they could protect themselves, and if somebody's breaking into your property, and since Brett lived there, you can defend yourself, but only if they enter the building, which they had. 4 Legionnaires ended up getting killed that day, and they were, you know, pretty important people to the town. And in their minds, they were going to run out some riffraff. One IWW member was killed, and that was Wesley Everest. He was the one that the mob had out during the day. They had just backed off, taken him to the prison, or to jail at this time. At one time, there were like 27 guys in one cell. Anyway, they took him back to jail, but that night the lights go out, and some guys end up disappearing from the jail cell, including Wesley Everest. He ends up getting hung. His body hanging from the bridge over the river was shot 40 times. They cut him down. He was in the river. The next day they get worried. They pull him out of the river because they don't want any reporters taking pictures, right? And they don't want to be looked upon in a bad light. They take him back, throw him back in the jail cell where the other guys are. His body's in there for 2 days. Neither undertaker in town want anything to do with them. They finally bury his body. Things aren't good. Poor Mrs. McAllister, she spends 22 days in jail. And they kept hammering her about where was Eugene. And she kept saying, he was with me the whole time. He had nothing to do with this. Well, the story is that Eugene was and he really was, very well spoken. He witnessed the whole thing. He needed to not be a witness. And if he was one of the accused, he couldn't be, was the argument. And in fact, not only did they accuse him of it, they blamed him for firing the shot that killed Warren Grimm. Super interesting to me that they tried all of these guys for the same murder, and they tried them as a group. And their lawyer actually, they end up getting a lawyer from the union, Vanderveer. He shows up elsewhere also. And Elmer Smith, their lawyer, you know, he's one of them that's been arrested. So Vanderveer shows up. Before Vanderveer can get there, he sends an assistant. They won't let, I don't know who they are. There's a group of people who won't let him get off the train to start with. Vanderveer shows up in a couple of weeks. They only charged for one of the murders, even though 4 guys were killed, because That way they could keep testimony out about everything that happened and try to just focus on this one guy that they thought they could prove was not at the hall. That the Wobblies had come out of the hall into the streets, the Wobblies had started firing, they were innocent, they had done nothing wrong, and these terrible murdering guys just attacked them. So, their argument, of course, is it was self-defense, we had every right to defend ourselves. It had obviously got out of hand. Okay, so, this is the original 11. Of these 11, these 7 are convicted. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, we should back up. The one in the middle is Eugene. He's our hero of our story. The poor kid in the back, on the right, on my right, he's like 16 or 17 years old, Lauren Roberts, and he's not mentally stable from the get-go. This kid is freaking out and just hearing voices right away. He's like saying anything and everything just to get out of there, and he ends up being, I don't know, they don't ever say he was innocent because of insanity, but definitely they say this kid's insane. He ends up in an insane asylum. Eventually, surprise, surprise, he ends up at Walla Walla with these guys. These are the 7 that end up going to prison. So the lawyer, Elmer, and one other man, they were found innocent. The jury tried to give them as much slack as they could. During this trial, legionnaires were paid to come in uniform, hundreds of them, and be present. The jurors were coached. The jurors, somebody broke into Elmer Smith's office and took a bunch of papers illegally, and they used that as evidence. The judge openly, no bones about it, the judge openly said, hey, I don't like you. I don't like Wobblies. I don't like what you stand for. I don't have any sympathy for you at all. So they were found guilty. The jurors tried to give Eugene murder in the 3rd degree, and the judge was like, there's no such thing as murder in the 3rd degree, because they wanted him to have some leniency. So then they said, okay, they're all guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. Okay. So they go to jail. The lawyer and another one of these original 11, they were found not guilty, so they were immediately charged with murdering one of the other guys, and they go to jail. But it didn't stick at all. I'm surprised, and they end up both getting off. Smith gets his, obviously he had his license revoked for practicing law. He did end up getting it back in 1930, and it didn't stop him from practicing law. He worked on this case his whole life, actually. It made him sick. He ended up getting divorced. He had ulcers, but he really stuck with it. And a lot of people really were behind these guys, and worked really hard to try to clear their names.
Jennifer?
Yes.
Excuse me. It's one
How?
man.
Oh my gosh, that's my problem. Okay, we wrap this up.
Sure.
How are we doing? Okay, can I keep going a little bit here? Okay. All right, we're gonna wrap this up as much as possible. I told you it's such a long, convoluted story. Okay, so let me show you some evidence really quick. This is something that those guys took out. Before this happened, they were like, they knew it was gonna happen. The union members knew it was gonna happen, and they took out this they wrote this flyer and hung it up and said, hey, Centralia, we are begging you. Please help us out. Don't let people take the law into their own hands. If we've violated any law, great. Then send the sheriff and we'll talk about it. And sure enough, it did happen. So this was like proof that they knew it was going to happen. They definitely were attacked. There's tons of evidence like this. Esther is working really hard to free them, haha, 100 years later, to exonerate them, to get a posthumous pardon. She says she's going to keep working on it. 2 weeks ago, the governor of Washington was presented with a petition to pardon them, and he said, nope, I don't feel comfortable doing this because it happened 100 years ago, and there's no reason to stir anything like this up. What was happening in Wallowa at that time? Here's a March 1920 newspaper. Here's the article on the front page of the Wallowa newspaper about the Centralia men who were arrested. It said that they were going to appeal it. That didn't go anywhere. They went straight to jail. Here's an article about the coal question, about the president's plan to settle the national coal strike, and how it has failed, and we're still going to have all these terrible problems. That's what was playing at the McLean Theater. I thought this was interesting. You often hear of someone who's gone wrong, but do you hear anything about those who go right? What an interesting quote to have in the newspaper. All right, so Eugene's, back up here. Eugene's in jail. This is a picture of the wives and kids that come to visit when they can. I don't know if you guys have ever been from Walla Walla to Lewiston. It's not a great road now. I can't imagine what it was like, in 1920. But they came whenever they possibly could. Sometimes they would come and not even get to visit with their spouses. Sometimes they'd go to parole meetings, and the parole meeting would be for whatever reason they decided not to have it that night. It was very difficult. Esther and Cliff are third from the right there. And she sells the homestead, of course, moves into town, makes it her way as best as she possibly can. She runs a lunch counter. She's very sick. She's really, really starting to fail, and she had a gallbladder removed, and she had a liver drained. No, it was her appendix was removed. And they did a state-of-the-art procedure on her where they didn't sew up the incision. They left 3 pearl buttons so that she could open it up and drain the wound easily. Wasn't that handy? Well, needless to say, it became a terrible infected mess. It just made matters worse. She ends up in the hospital in Lewiston. She's got cancer. She's so sick. Eugene's mom had been writing the governor every week for years. And she finally wrote the governor's wife, please talk to your husband. Eugene's wife is sick, and she needs him, and he decides to give him 6 months reprieve. Before that, Eugene wrote this poem. Eugene's a great writer. He writes articles for magazines while he's in jail. He works as a tailor while he's in jail. He does everybody's reading and writing of the other prisoners. He has a third grade education, right? So he writes this poem for Effie. This is the picture he had in his cell all that time. And it makes me wonder, do you think she rode to Wallowa Lakeside Saddle? Possibly. I hope not. So anyway, while he's there, he writes her this poem. The guard reads the poem and says, that is beautiful. We should get Harry Chandler, the prison composer, to put music to this thing. Eugene was like, well, okay. So they make it into a song, and Jennifer's going to play a song for you. That's pure and true. You're the only girl in all the world for me. I could never love another in the same way I love you. Oh, darling, say mine you'll ever be. Then the maiden snuggles close happy little sigh and rests her head upon his heaving breast, saying, "Sure, sweetheart, I love you, and I'm yours until I die." It's just so sad. Just as true, dear, as Wallow is in the West. And it goes on in a second verse, and it has them as old, silver-haired couple that return to the lake.
When they printed them and sold the sheet music.
They sold the sheet music. He printed 1,000 copies to be sold at 50 cents a piece, and all the money was to go to Esther and to Cliff to help her out. So it's not long after this that he gets his 6-month reprieve. Oh, by the way, he wrote a whole little poetry book too while he was in there with all the illustrations he did himself. And I'm looking for that too. Anyway, he gets out, and Effie lives 92 days. She lives 92 days, partly because he was there to care for her. He takes her to a sanatorium in Missouri, and then it's not looking good. And in fact, it was on the way home. If you're ever going to get back home and see your people, now's the time. And they didn't quite make it. She died on the train, and the family met him in Pendleton. And this is a different one of his love poems to her is on her tombstone. And this is in Clarkston. And he's now buried by her, and he has one of his poems about hunting with hounds on his grave. He ends up remarrying a gal from Anatone. She's 20 years younger, at least. She thinks he's amazing because he's this cowboy, logger, songwriter. I don't know how long she thought that, actually, after they got married, because it's, that's a whole nother story. The saga continues. But she has a pile of kids, and one of them is Esther. She ends up with 4 that live, and Esther is the second to youngest. She's 80, lives in Lewiston, and she's the one that wrote this. And she talks about, oh, by the way, I want to tell you one more thing about Wallowa Lake. After Effie died, he and Cliff, who's now 14 years old, go to Wallowa Lake, and he's got some piece of property that he probably bought for a song, I don't know, literally. And they have a shooting range for tourists. And so that's what he does for a while. And Clifford's just sure some careless tourist is going to shoot him in his sleep. They live in this little shed behind. They end up going back to Clarkston. But, as they're traveling back and forth, they stop in Anatone all the time. That's how he met this little gal that becomes his second wife. And he tells her straight up, "I'm always going to love Effie, and I'm going to be buried by her when I die. But, if you're okay with that, then okay." And that's what happened. So, and Esther tells me when she was a kid, they'd come to Wallowa Lake, and they would do things like have lunch with Chief Joseph, because they would sit at the monument and have their lunch, and Jean would tell them the story. And she also tells me things like they would go to visit one of the descendants of Chief Lawyer and visit, and he named her Princess Evening Star. So she made all of her siblings call her Princess Evening Star. So anyway, well, that's Eugene Barnet. If you're interested, I have some books from the History Center if you'd like to buy one. And thank you for putting up with me. So interesting.
We have a vinyl record.
Oh yes, there is. Yes. Sally is right. There is a recording of this song, and it's a Chicago big band, and it's terrible. It's so terrible, because it just isn't what I think it should be, right? And in fact, one thing I love the most about the song is it says, "should be played slowly with little regard to the timing." And I thought, well, that's just a perfect Wallowa County song, don't you think? So anyway, yes. And we have like I said, the original sheet music at the History Center too.